By the end of the war with Japan, the CCP was significantly strengthened and the GMD weakened, so much so that the communists could move from the guerrilla warfare phase of combat to a phase of more conventional fighting. The first period of the Civil War was essentially a Chinese war. The second would be more of an international affair. The polarization of the international political context through the development of the Cold War meant that China's civil war could not be an internal struggle alone. The war between the nationalists and the communists in China had become part of a larger Soviet-American effort to create a new post-war balance of power. Both superpowers wanted a stable China and a weakened Japan, and to this end, they both wanted the GMD and the CCP to form a coalition government. The USSR wanted influence in Manchuria, and the US accepted this desire to a certain extent. The Americans worked hard to achieve a diplomatic solution between the CCP and the GMD, yet neither side was willing to share power. General Marshall was given the responsibility of brokering the deal and managed to get the GMD and the CCP to agree to some terms. But negotiations were being finalized in February 1946. Both sides were moving troops into Manchuria. There would not be a diplomatic solution in China. Its fate would be decided on the battlefield. It's also important to note that in 1945, even though the CCP had gained importance during the Sino-Japanese War, the GMD still had 4 million troops compared to the CCP's 1 million. The GMD also had more heavy weaponry. At first, the GMD, with more troops and better equipment, forced the communists onto the defensive. Following the Japanese surrender in August 1945, the Red Army under General Lin Biao entered Manchuria to secure this important industrial region under communist control. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allies had agreed that the USSR would invade Manchuria following Germany's surrender. The Soviets had duly invaded and were in control when the CCP forces arrived, whereupon the Soviets gave the CCP large stockpiles of Japanese weapons. The USSR was clearly not neutral. General Albert Weidemeyer, the Allied commander of the Southeast Asia Theater, authorized Chiang to resist the communists by using U.S. ships and aircraft. The U.S. could no longer claim to be neutral either. Although the CCP forces were better armed than before, the GMD greatly outnumbered them. The CCP also had to fight conventionally in Manchuria, defending and holding its positions and territory. The GMD was able to force the CCP out of the cities, and in December 1945, Mao reverted to his policy of creating bases outside of the city. It seemed as though Manchuria had been won by the GMD, but despite their early victory achievements, they continued to govern the region as they had others during the war with Japan, and this led to political defeat. Indeed, corruption was worse than it had been before, which encouraged Manchurians to support the CCP. President Truman sent General Marshall to mediate in the conflict, attempting to prevent a civil war and to avert U.S. involvement in the fighting. U.S. policy continued to be to promote a coalition government. The Americans were in a difficult position as they did not support single-party states and wanted to refrain from a position as a mediator, even though they continued to arm Chiang Kai-shek. The truce facilitated by Marshall broke down in March 1946. By May, the GMD was in control of the central area of Manchuria. The CCP demanded a ceasefire and condemned U.S. support for Chiang Kai-shek. At this point, U.S. intervention, according to Chiang Kai-shek, played a key role in the outcome of the Civil War. In June, General Marshall managed to get Chiang to agree to another truce. The ceasefire worked to the CCP's advantage as it saved them from a final assault on their headquarters. The communists used the time to train forces and ready them for war. Mao also introduced land reforms in the area. Land reform led the peasants to joining the communists, as their victory would mean they could keep their land. Fighting resumed in July, and the Red Army, now called the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, reverted to guerrilla warfare. The GMD recaptured cities in Manchuria and went on in March 1947 to take the CCP capital. Yet cities in Manchuria were now isolated, and Mao could use guerrilla techniques effectively. The PLA cut the GMD forces off by targeting their supply routes and the railways. By March 1948, the remaining American advisors told Chiang Kai-shek to leave Manchuria to protect his forces. At this point, the GMD and the CCP were quite evenly matched in terms of their military manpower and resources. Chiang refused to acknowledge that the balance had shifted unfavorably and that the PLA now had more heavy weapons than the GMD. He fought on, but in March 1948, the CCP was in control of Manchuria. Chiang Kai-shek had lost 40,000 troops. Capitalizing on its success, the PLA launched an offensive against the vital railroad junction at Jiajiao. Here the Communists fought a conventional battle, relying on massed heavy artillery. The defeat of the Nationalists was a huge blow for Chiang's men, both strategically and psychologically. In the same month, January 1949, Lin Biao took the cities of Tianjin and then Beijing. The whole of northern China, including Manchuria, was now under communist control. In April, the PLA launched the final series of offensives, taking Nanjing and then Shanghai in May. In October, the rest of it was taken. By October 1st, 1949, Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, saying, "Our nation will never again be an insulted nation. We have stood up." What were the reasons for the communist success? First, guerrilla tactics and revolutionary warfare. The CCP used guerrilla tactics successfully in the first phase of the Civil War, also in the fight against the Japanese and in Manchuria in the second phase of the war. Also, the leadership played a role. The PLA was led by Lin Biao, who was an excellent military commander and who was able to transform the PLA from a guerrilla fighting force into a regular army. The PLA was greatly strengthened in the final stages of the war by desertions from the nationalist forces and through capturing enemy weapons. Through better conditions and political indoctrination, the PLA was a much more effective fighting force with far higher morale than the nationalist troops. In addition, the good behavior of the communist soldiers attracted much support from the peasants. Mao's leadership was central to communist success. It was his leadership in the Long March and his innovative guerrilla tactics that allowed the CCP to survive and then to broaden its support base. He was able to take advantage of the opportunity presented by the war with Japan and also adapt his ideas and policies to the changing military situation. For example, although revolutionary ideas involving attacking the bourgeoisie or middle class during the war against Japan, he stressed the idea that this was a national struggle in which all classes should cooperate. Also, the communists used the period during the war with Japan to spread communist ideas throughout the areas they had captured. The policy continued in the second phase of the Civil War. Land reform continued in all rural areas captured by the communists. As the communists moved into towns, they also spread communist ideas. The army would take control of the towns, working to prevent crime, control food distribution, and establish fair taxation systems. These activities broadened the base of support for the CCP. The superior intelligence of the communists in the second phase of the Civil War played an important role in their victory. Chiang's assistant chief of staff, Liu Fei, was a communist spy, as was the head of the GMD's war planning board. This meant that the communists knew all intended GMD moves in advance. In addition, several of the nationalist commanders were in fact communist agents. In Manchuria, for example, the nationalist commander was a communist agent, and his actions helped secure the PLA victory there. In contrast to this situation, the nationalists were unable to infiltrate the communists. Chiang Kai-shek continued to resist democratic changes, and his increasingly repressive regime alienated liberals in the middle classes. He failed to win mass support, and his government relied on a narrow, wealthy section of businessmen and landlords for its survival. The GMD's corruption and inefficiency further alienated the middle classes and also the peasants, who bore the brunt of an unfair tax system. Chiang Kai-shek's support base was further damaged by rampant inflation, which had a devastating effect on the middle classes. Chiang only took decisive action to deal with this in 1948, when a new currency was introduced and rationing started. These reforms were too late, however, and there was an economic collapse by 1949. U.S. observers thought that the poor quality of many of Chiang's troops and their low morale contributed to the high number of desertions at the end of the Civil War. The behavior of the army towards ordinary Chinese was also in sharp contrast to that of the Communist Army, with its strict rules of behavior. In terms of military leadership, Chiang also made serious mistakes, for instance, choosing to pour resources into Manchuria far from his real base of support. He also tried to interfere too much in the actual running of the campaigns, even though he was far removed from the actual action. The Americans had economic interests in China, and they had supported the GMD from the first phase of the Civil War. This support should have given the GMD key advantages over the CCP, and despite the problem of getting effective aid to the GMD, the U.S. provided Chiang with almost $3 billion in aid and large supplies of arms throughout World War II. At the beginning of the second stage of the Civil War, the Americans transported GMD forces by sea and air to the north of China, and U.S. troops occupied Beijing to hold them until the GMD were ready. In short, the USA did what it could to assist Chiang, but his regime was too ineffective to survive. Yet some historians believe that there should have been more military commitment from the U.S. and that this could have saved China from communism. The Americans were held responsible for Chiang for pressuring him to agree to truces at critical times during his war with the CCP. Finally, their mere presence also gave Mao excellent anti-GMD propaganda. The Soviets had been rather reluctant to support the CCP and did not give, in the end, the kind of military and economic assistance that the GMD received from the U.S. The involvement of the Comintern in the early stages of the CCP struggle with the GMD had led to division and near annihilation of Chiang's final enrichment campaign. Mao waged the rectification campaigns to oust Soviet supporters from the CCP. The USSR had backed both united fronts, and Stalin did not see that the CCP could win the Civil War until the later stages in 1948. Some historians view the Soviet assistance in Manchuria, which also included establishing military training colleges and training the CCP pilots, as essential to establishing the PLA as a more modern and effective force. Nevertheless, Stalin was worried that the U.S. would involve itself further in the Chinese Civil War and attempted to limit Mao's successes in the later stages of the conflict. In 1949, Stalin told Mao to consolidate his gains in the north and not cross the Yangtze into southern China. Mao ignored his advice. After the Civil War, the CCP consolidated its control in China and pursued the key ideas that they had initiated early on. The experience of the Long War were a guidebook for the new Chinese communist regime. Society had been militarized and Mao had a godlike status. Society would be changed by short and total campaigns, and all obstacles would be overcome by the power of the people. One of the key legacies of the Chinese Civil War is the continued authoritarian rule by the CCP. China remains a single-party state in which individual rights and freedoms are suppressed. In 1989, when young protesters on the streets of Tiananmen Square Beijing, were forcibly dispersed with guns and tanks. The battles of the Civil War were used to justify the actions of the state. Mao's victory led to the globalization of the Cold War, which spread from its seedbed in Europe to Asia. Asia was now a region in which the superpowers would struggle for control and influence. The communist victory inspired insurgencies in Indonesia, Malay, Indochina, and Thailand. It also led to the first hot war of the Cold War, the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953. Although the CCP's victory should have been viewed as a victory for the spread of communism and for the USSR, Stalin feared Mao as a rival for leadership of the communist world, and he had not wanted the Cold War to spread to Asia. Mao became convinced that Stalin planned to create a divided and weak China, which would leave the USSR dominant in Asia. He saw Stalin's policies as rooted in self-interest rather than true revolutionary doctrine. Nevertheless, once the CCP had won the Civil War, Mao visited Moscow in 1950, and this visit produced the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Alliance. This was the first treaty between the USSR and China. Sino-Soviet relations chilled again during the Korean War. Relations between the USSR and the PRC worsened dramatically after the death of Stalin. Khrushchev's attack on Stalin's cult of personality was seen by Mao as an attack on his own style of leadership, and the USSR's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 caused Mao to accuse Khrushchev of being a paper tiger. The Sino-Soviet split worsened, culminating in border clashes in 1969. Mao's victory led to much anxiety in the USA and seemed at the time to shift the balance of power in the Cold War in the USSR's favor. Many in the US initially saw the communist victory as inevitable, given the lack of support that existed for the nationalists in China in 1949. Nevertheless, as the Cold War intensified and McCarthyism took hold in the US, state officials were accused of having lost China. Stalin was now seen as having been the mastermind behind Mao's CCP. The US failed to understand the different types of communism, or that there was increasing tension and hostility between Mao and Stalin. The USA also refused to recognize the PRC as a legitimate state. Instead, they backed Chiang, Kai-shek, and the Chinese nationalists who had fled at the end of the Civil War to the island of Taiwan. The Americans then ensured that Taiwan and not the PRC was given China's seat at the United Nations. The U.S. initially perceived the CCP victory as an opening of a new front of the Cold War. Mao's victory was a key reason for the passing of a vast new military budget to fund the struggle against the spread of communism. It also led the U.S. into the Korean War and conflict over Taiwan. However, by the end of the 1960s, there was a radical change by both the Americans and the Communist Chinese in their policies and strategies towards one another. During the late 1960s, China and the USA entered into a period of dialogue known as ping-pong diplomacy. The character of this struggle is unique. The coming to power of the CCP was, in Marxist terms, unorthodox, being neither by a proletarian revolution nor by the liberation of the Soviet army. It was the outcome of a long struggle against feudal exploitation of the peasants by the landlords and exploitation by Western and Japanese control of China. The movement was fired by nationalism, the demand for reforms leading to social justice, and the desire for a strong and efficient central government. It was part of the cycle of peasant movements for national liberation which swept Asia and Africa after the Second World War. This was seen by the emerging nations of the Third World, which regarded Communist China highly. The success of the communists in China owed nothing to the help from USSR. In 1949, it was for the first time most of China had been united under a strong government since the decline of the Manchu dynasty in the 19th century.